Coming up, the New York Football Giants are not playing in the playoffs. Shocker there, but they are losing potentially more coaches and front office personnel to the free agent market when it comes to the New Orleans Saints, when it comes to GM roles. What exactly do we take away from so many potential candidates being poached from the New York staff? We dive in, coming up next. Yes, my friends, it's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your host. Over here, Adam Arbich. Over there, Andrew Mackwitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise. We're going to get into Mike Kafka. We're going to get into Brandon Brown and what's going on for the Giants. Ryan Cowden's name is going to come back up here in this discussion for a very specific reason, Andy. But as we come off the weekend, divisional round playoffs, an NFC East championship matchup with the Eagles and the Commanders. We'll talk about that in the back end, too. How are we starting on Monday morning?
Happy Martin Luther King Day.
That's right.
Hopefully everyone in the Northeast is safe after, 6 to 8 inches of snow. Adam, I'm doing great. I'm doing wonderful. Life is good. And the only thing, as you mentioned before, is, man, an NFC East rivalry to go to the Super Bowl that doesn't include the Giants is pretty painful.
Yeah, I mean, listen, we're going to talk about it on the back end, too. I feel very differently about each organization and each team. I also feel very differently than some people are insisting we need to feel about Saquon Barkley and what's going on and what it means for the Giants. We'll get to all of that. Quick side note here. We're on the East Coast. People complaining about the snow. You got to knock it off. You don't live in Tennessee. 4, 6, 8 inches of snow. That's why you live here. It's what you're about. Knock it off with the complaining. Snowpocalypse. Jesus. Get over it, people. Anyway, I'm fired up. We come off the weekend. We'll talk about the games. But interestingly enough, as we've gotten into this offseason, we said, wasn't really a lot of buzz around key figures for the New York Football Giants. All of a sudden, Ryan Cowden, he leaves and goes to New England. That's going to play a factor when we get to Brown. But first and foremost, are you surprised that Kafka is getting flown out, as reported by Tom Pelissero, to New Orleans? He had the over the Zoom meeting. He's now going for the in-person meeting. He certainly seems to be at least down into one of the finalists for that job. Are you surprised that he's made it this far in this cycle, as he's been considered, at least on paper, in theory, for coaching jobs in previous cycles as well?
Yeah, it is slightly interesting to me because while he got promoted with the Giants, he took on less responsibility in terms of the day-to-day, and Brian Daboll took play calling duties away from him. And so it feels like kind of Mike Kafka has been sitting out on an island for the Giants. The other thing, Adam, for me, and maybe I'm just jaded, but knowing that Mike Kafka completes interviews for the Rooney Rule, knowing that he is a minority candidate, like it kind of skews things for me a little bit. Does it do the same thing for you? Are you like, are they just doing this to satisfy some of the check marks, or are they actually interested in hiring Mike Kafka?
Well, my only difference here is because, by the way, the Rooney Rule is clearly broken in some type of capacity, right? Because even guys, I can't remember what the example was. They had ties to the organization. They basically brought him in to do I think it was New England, right? They brought somebody in there like, we're hiring
Pep Hamilton. They brought in, and you're like, he hasn't coached in like a decade. Right? You're interviewing him for your head coaching job. Like, what are you talking about?
Exactly. So it's like, those things, you're like, oh, well, it's a guy that we knew, or someone that hasn't been getting any buzz around head coaching jobs. And you bring him in because he's a former, video coordinator for you. Now it's the new organization, and it helps start to get their name mentioned in those circles. So there's a lot of problems with that. The only reason why, when it comes to Kafka and the Saints, that I find it interesting is that it really, to me, is about the other candidates and other job openings, right? So Vrabel was never going to be on their radar. He's clearly going to go to New England. But then you think about an Aaron Glenn, who has ties to the Saints organization, obviously, but also has ties to the Jets. And it seems like he might be a front runner for that. You have Mike McCarthy, who's now out there because the Dallas Cowboys, of course, are going to do something different for their position there as well. And then even some people have re-brought up the name of Pete Carroll, even though he's been now removed from coaching for a year and is obviously on the older side. What I find interesting is the Saints are probably not the first choice on a lot of these top coaching candidates lists. And then the other part being, where do the Saints think they are, right? Because if you think that you're ready to dive right back in, reports say that they're going to run it back with Carr. That's a choice too. But, that dictates who you might want to bring in. And so I still, with this little thing about satisfying the Rooney Rule, I have this curiosity about what is the perception of Mike Kafka around the league? Do people still look back to Kansas City and say, I think about Kafka the way I did then, not the way people think about him or the Giants now? That's the part that I do get a little bit lost in the sauce on where people stand on Kafka.
It is interesting that you mentioned who's the favorite to land certain jobs. It sounds like Aaron Glenn wants the Jets. The Jets kind of want Aaron Glenn. We'll see if
Right.
they find a way to mess that up. But Adam, there's been a little chatter of Mike McCarthy potentially going to the Saints or potentially
Yes.
interviewing with them. I don't honestly know how desirable the New Orleans Saints job is. We talk all the time about how there's only 32 head coaching positions, so each one is very favorable. They're over 50 million over the cap. They are stuck with Derek Carr. Releasing him gets them zero cap relief. I think it actually increases the cap by $1 million or $2 million. They have nowhere to turn. They have to restructure or release a ton of veterans on a team that was extremely mediocre to begin with, and they're going to have to replace them with veteran minimum guys or ask all of their players to take a pay cut. So when you think about who's the candidate that is the sexy name on the block, Adam, that's looking at this saying, you know what? I want to be 50 million over the cap with Derek Carr and releasing all of our good players like Alvin Kamara. When you look at it that way, it's like, wouldn't you? Well, if you were Ben Johnson, you would immediately decline this request to interview, right?
Yes. Well, yeah, right. So that's the part of it. Yeah. These top candidates aren't like, oh, do I want to come maybe and think about the Saints? Obviously not. And by the way, if you go and look at head coaching odds right now, Bears, Ben Johnson is top of their list at minus 200. Mike McCarthy is behind him, and then Pete Carroll. The Cowboys have Deion Sanders now at plus 150 with Jason Witten, Kellen Moore close behind him there. The Jaguars list Liam Cohen. They list Robert Saleh. They list Ben Johnson, which I think now we feel like we're getting a little bit further away from. Aaron Glenn is top, as you mentioned there, for the Jets, with Brian Flores behind him. When you get down past the Raiders, where Ben Johnson is also the top to land that, and then Deion Sanders is right behind him. So if you don't get one job, you're going to another job potentially. But when you get to the Saints, it's Mike McCarthy right now at minus 250. Aaron Glenn still listed there were he to make a different choice. Joe Brady, Kellen Moore, Cliff Kingsbury for the Washington Commanders offensive coordinator, David Shaw, Bobby Slowick, and then Mike Kafka at plus 2,500. So, and I understand that part of it, because as you start to list the other names, not even the top guys, as you start to list some of the other names, you start to remind yourself, right, they've been kind of doing some things as coordinators these last couple of years. One of the biggest downsides for Mike Kafka right now is it doesn't have to be his fault. It's that he's with a bad organization right now. He lost the play calling this past season. So there's not a lot of sexy cachet to what he's been doing. And that's what you need. You need to be Ben Johnson crushing it with the Lions over the last couple of years, even with their loss over the weekend, say, look what I've been capable of doing. Same thing for Aaron Glenn and others.
You mentioned Cliff Kingsbury on the short list there. If you're Cliff Kingsbury, who's now has Jaden Daniels and is in the NFC Championship game, he's already been a head coach and been fired once. He's got one more shot at this to be a head coach.
Yeah.
Are you putting all your chips on a team that's over the cap with Derek Carr as an aging veteran with no cap space? Like, Cliff Kingsbury looks at that job and says, thanks, but no thanks. I'll stick with Jaden Daniels for another year, and then we'll be a much more desirable head coaching position available for me.
Because guess what? 6.5 is the over-under on coaches that get fired every single year. So there'll be a whole new cycle after this. So I agree with you on Cliff. And it's funny, too, one little note from a Giants perspective, only because someone threw this out there. It was like, one of the worst decisions the Giants made was not making Spagnuolo the head coach. And I was like, first of all, this is like a papoose, a cornucopia of mistakes that you could
revisionist history too, right?
Well, yeah, 100%, by the way, because he was the interim head coach and it didn't look so good. But also, I was like, but some guys, and I don't think this is Cliff for the long term, but in the short term, some guys are just awesome coordinators. Dick LeBeau for the Pittsburgh Steelers. It was like, hey, man, you crush it at that. Why rock the boat on it, even though you want to get paid, even though everyone wants that ultimate challenge? If you're Spagnuolo, I'm sure he's going to get interviews. But also, he probably goes, this is a pretty nice ride. And I have total control, and the organization find ways to replenish and give me money and give me assets and picks and, free agency. So sometimes, man, that grass always being greener, or to your point, like Cliff, it's like, I'm going to go take that job. Jaguars. Come on, Cliff Kingsbury, come down to Jacksonville. Like, to that dysfunction. Oh, I'm going to wait another cycle, see what comes up.
Adam, question for you specifically around Mike Kafka. I'll ask you the same about when we get to the GM candidate as well. Do you want Kafka to take the job with the New Orleans Saints? Do you want him to get a head coaching position?
Well, obviously we do, Andy, because that gets us 2 third-round compensatory picks if he becomes a head coach. And that's what we're talking about, baby. In the end, and we didn't bury this lead. We've known this going back to last offseason when they changed it over, when they retained him and they gave him the quote unquote promotion, certainly in title only. That's why we're dreaming on him leaving and going somewhere else. And even beyond that, I'll ask you the question in return. Yes, we want him to get hired. Do you think the only reason that Mike Kafka is still on the Giants staff is because there are compensatory picks attached to him potentially leaving for another job?
Well, I think he's obviously well respected and well regarded around the league, and
I
like
think
his
so.
and for
Remember, New York is
everything
where
that's
your career
happened.
goes to die, so we have to, caveat it.
Well, and the other thing is, like, he's been a pro about everything that has happened within the Giants organization. They basically
Yeah.
demoted him, then promoted him in title, but took away his play calling duties. And like he's been a good soldier for the organization. So when you look at it, Mike Kafka has been everything the Giants have asked him to be. But the simple answer for me, and I think we both wholeheartedly agree on this, is you get 2 third-round compensatory picks if Mike Kafka goes. Do you plan on keeping Mike Kafka around after this season? He's only got 1 year left on his deal. Do you see him as the head coach in waiting if Brian Daboll ends up getting fired? If the answer is he's not going to be around and he's not the next head coach, take the 2 third-round picks and get any other younger offensive mind that you think has a chance to be here long term. To me, I think you agree. This is a no-brainer, and we hope that Mike Kafka gets an opportunity to showcase what he can do because he has been seen as very highly regarded around the league.
Again, low on a lot of lists, but maybe teams that strike out, maybe he ends up getting an interview somewhere even beyond the Saints because it does feel like they may have a different direction in mind. We'll wait and see. Chicago Bears, why not them? They seem to be the kind of organization that makes mistakes around these type of decisions. We'll go ahead and continue that conversation as the offseason rolls along and maybe talk about if Kafka leaves, where do we want to go when it comes to the offensive coordinator position? Coming up here in a second, though, the assistant GM is exiting. I'll tell you why that's a bigger problem than just losing someone who's considered to be a bright young mind around the NFL. We'll do that here in just one moment. Okay, Andy. So the other thing that comes out here, and we had said this at the start of the offseason, we were like, why isn't Brown's name getting mentioned in GM interviews? We're, he's the sexy young mind. Watch out for this guy. And then it was radio silence. But now the chatter is happening. Now he is getting interviews, getting second interviews. Do you know why this is a really big problem to me for the New York Giants?
I can take a guess if you'd like. If I could try to jump in the mind of Adam Armbrecht,
Please.
I can
Please,
give it a
please.
swing.
Enter the pantheon that is my mind.
So my thought on this is that Brandon Brown has not seemed to be 100% on the same page as Joe Shane. It feels like he's someone in the room that's like, are we sure you want to do this? Are you sure you want Saquon to go? Are you sure? And when you get rid of people that at least challenge some of the things that you're going to do, it ends up being like groupthink and group speak. And then all of a sudden you have no one disagreeing with the GM that is in place. How close am I to where you are at?
Well, first of all, yes, not only because you want challenging conversations within your walls, but more importantly, if you are a member of the fan base that looks at the Giants and says, I don't know if I think Joe Shane has made all the right decisions. We don't know what would have been if Brown called the shots. But because you have this contrast, you go, but it probably could have been better. Why? Because this has been about as bad as it gets. But I'll actually go a layer deeper for you, Andy. What's really concerning me, because listen, guys come up, they move on, and that's the nature of it. You want to have talent, and it's a compliment if other teams want them. One of the big problems is that you're seeing potentially when Ryan Cowden left to go to New England, and now maybe Brown leaves. So now maybe people that we think are talented inside the organization are jettisoning, and we're being left with guys that we have real questions about at the GM and head coaching spot. But it's the Cowden move to me that makes this even more concerning in some ways, because the premise was the Giants said, we're not going to stand in the way of a career advancement opportunity for someone on our staff. Okay, but if Brown leaves to go become a head GM, you could have promoted Cowden potentially. I'm not saying that he is assistant GM ready. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. But when you hear the personnel decisions and some of the things that he did in the draft and where his influence existed inside the organization, I take a step back and go, so we're letting everybody leave. We're just going down the chain of command that everybody walks. So maybe this is a little reverse engineered because you didn't know Brown might get those interviews, but good organizations do know that. Good organizations anticipate, are we going to lose some people? And if so, how do we make sure we keep some of the better minds around?
Yeah, that is an interesting point. I think the tough part is you can't if Ryan Cowden gets offered something from the Patriots and it is a promotion,
Of
and you
course.
look and say, "Well, we'd like to promote you, but it depends on if Brandon Brown gets his second interview with XYZ team." There's a lot
Yeah,
of like,
the timing message. Yeah, the timing's
yeah,
at a sinker, right?
it becomes a challenge, and all of a sudden he's like, "So wait, you're going to promote me, but it's contingent on other people interviewing for other jobs." Like then all of a sudden it gets very confusing. And the tough part is like, what if Ryan Cowden came into Joe Shane's office and was like, "Look, I can be the assistant GM with an idea that I will be the GM. As I appreciate everything you did, but as long as you're here, I can never, like be the GM of this organization. I
Of
also
course.
worked with Mike Vrabel. We get along well. Like, is Joe Shane going to be like, no, you can't move, and then you have an unhappy person that you're blocking from making changes? I think overall the reason why it's concerning to us is because if you take Brandon Brown out of here and you take Ryan Cowden and it's just Joe Shane, and it's a tire fire again. What are the Giants doing? Where are they going next? Who's the next mind that you turn to turn around and say, we've got someone in the building that can turn this around? It feels like if Brandon Brown leaves, another person who has that promise is out the building.
Silver lining to this, if we want to try to do it, is that whoever they put into these roles will be first years and promotions. If Brown ends up moving on, promotions from within. The silver lining is we've stripped away some of the other things that maybe were helping influence and helping provide whatever level of success, whether it's on the field a few years ago in the playoffs or when it comes to free agency or when it comes to the draft, right? We always, as you should, you have to put the success and failures at the feet of the GM, at the feet of the head coach. So now walking into this year, you go, okay, those, maybe they were doing some of the heavy lifting for you, Joe or Brian. It's on you now. Prove that you're worth it, right? Prove that this is the path we should have taken. And it always comes back to, for me, and I'm fairly certain you agree, it's like, this is why it feels funky to have stuck with Joe Shane and Brian Dable, because it does feel like, not that they deserve any sympathy, but it does feel like you're entering in a very needle threading season where everyone will go, yes, you are the right people for the jobs in these roles. And that doesn't mean you can win some games and still lose your job, because there's a lot you have to accomplish in this one season.
Now, Adam, question for you before we move on to the teams that are still playing and that are actually relevant
Oh
in
my
the
God,
NFL.
football?
Yeah. So Mike Kafka, Brandon Brown. If they both end up getting hired during this cycle, the Giants would get 3 third-round compensatory picks. They're basically, you can't double stack it where you get 4. They've like figured out like if both get hired, then all of a sudden you get 3. But honestly, Adam, I think you probably feel the same way as me. If the Giants need those 3 third-round compensatory picks more than they need Brandon Brown and Mike Kafka in the building, because if this thing is a tire fire next season and the Giants need to reset the whole thing, wouldn't you rather have 3 more third round picks to be able to develop and have like a whole new GM and coaching staff to do it?
On the Mike Kafka side, 100% agree, because I don't think we're ever going to look back over the next 5 years, 10 years, 50 years and go, Mike Kafka, damn it, we missed it. Now, Brown, I don't know, but I will say, if you told me I had to give up, 2 third-round compensatory picks to guarantee that I got, there is a world where we look back and he gets his job and he's a GM somewhere, and we look at what he does with their roster, and 2-3 years from now, we're having, I know fans kind of, not wrongly, but people have warped this idea of Adam Peters, who was my number 1 GM candidate for the Giants. They go, well, yeah, sure, if you get Jaden Daniels. I'm like, yeah, well, either way you slice it, they were in a position. They took the quarterback. They didn't go a different way. They could have taken a different quarterback. They made the right pick, right? So there is that world where you have to kind of calculate what could have been, what will be, and what's going to progress going forward. So what happens with Brown would dictate it. Even if Kafka goes somewhere else and is a head coach and the team has success, I'm not going to reflect on it any differently. So I might split them. I might split them down the middle here. But again, it wouldn't take much for me to get excited about other assistant GMs that could be brought in for the Giants, right? So it probably is all relative in the end. Bottom line being, the Giants aren't playing any football right now, and they're talking about whether or not they're going to lose staff off of a 3-win team. So what do we know? What does this organization know? Honestly, I'll tell you what we know. We know that the NFC East is going to represent the NFC Championship game. We know that Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs, shockingly, are going to their 7th AFC Championship game. What did we take away from the weekend that was, and where do our expectations lie as we head towards that championship round? We'll do that here to close things out in just one moment. Andrew, I don't want to shock you. 3 wins doesn't make the playoffs. So the New York Football Giants were not a part of it wild card weekend, and they did not get a bye. It wasn't a shocking they had a bye and they weren't going to play till the divisional round. This is not a shocking theme. I want your takeaways from the weekend on a high level, but turnovers matter. Turnovers matter in a big way, and I don't look at it as referendums about certain players. There is something that I took away from that Ravens-Bills game last night, but that's the theme, man. Lose the turnover battle, and you are going to lose these games. Did any one game over this weekend stand out to you as, if not for turnovers, the winning team would have been different?
No, the turnover battle, to your point, was the common theme. My I had a couple of takeaways. One, Jaden Daniels is so poised when he steps back in the pocket. I
Yep,
cannot
he's
believe
legit.
that he's a rookie. I just cannot. I can't even fathom it. He might already be the best quarterback in the NFC. Like I don't know if that's hyperbole. I don't know if it's the rum punch of the
Prisoner of the
NFC,
moment, sure. Yeah.
championship game, but he looks amazing and he looks poised in the pocket. That was one of my takeaways. Two is Saquon Barkley is amazing. He
Yeah.
is a freak athlete, and he would not be doing any of this if he was still a New York Giant. Was kind of what my takeaway was. And I was getting a bunch of texts from family and friends at him about Saquon, like, I can't believe we let him go. You know, that just retreading that same argument over and over again. What I watched was when the offensive line blocks the people that they're supposed to, and Saquon Barkley gets past the line of scrimmage and he gets a secondary player one-on-one, he's going to win that every single time. The problem is the Giants weren't good enough to block the people on the defensive line, so he never really got those opportunities. So my big takeaway is I'm not surprised, but the Saquon Barkley argument just continues to come up as he goes for another 200 yards in the playoffs.
Yeah, I don't know why people. I saw things. I won't. I'm not calling anybody out here, but people were producing this narrative of, oh well, remember when everyone said Saquon was washed? And that's why you don't resign him. Whoops, looks like you made. Nobody said that. I mean, nobody of any NFL football intelligence said Saquon's washed. That's why you're not re-signing. That wasn't what it was. You can talk about the organizational decision, where the Giants were. Your point is 100% accurate. It's one of the top offensive lines, if not the top offensive line in the NFL. That's why Saquon's able to do what he do. And that's why you pay a guy like that, right? That's why you're willing to pay. And by the way, running backs this past season, talk about it wasn't nearly as high of a cost when it comes to Derrick Henry, but he had a phenomenal year. Saquon had a phenomenal year. Josh Jacobs had a phenomenal year, right? Like bringing in the veteran running backs paid off for most of these teams, and they were all pretty darn good teams as well. That is a huge part of it. Now, the interesting thing to me is you mentioned about the reason why I asked about turnovers. Like, I directly can look at that Rams-Eagles game. They lost that turnover battle. The Rams had 2. Eagles had none. They played clean. That could be a very different game if Stafford doesn't have that fumble, if they don't have those issues there. Likewise, the Ravens game, I 100% point this out, and this is where I'm going to give some credit to Josh Allen, because one of Josh Allen's things is I'm a bit of a gunslinger. I like to keep it sexy. Sometimes I make mistakes and I throw turnovers, right? And instead, there's the unfortunate fumble there for Lamar Jackson. He throws that airmail, which is so funny because he throws that airmail interception early in the game. And Josh Allen does the same thing like 3 possessions later, but he airmails it way past. And I was like, I think that's all that Lamar was trying to do. He's like, live to play another day. And it just stayed in bounds and stayed within reach. But those things matter, right? Get out of your own way. If you flip that turnover battle in that game, I don't think the Bills are overcoming those issues. So again, turnovers, man. If you play even on that, the Ravens are winning that game. I mean, heck, Mark Andrews had a chance, right? And I got to tell you, we love Mark Andrews as a tight end, as one of the best tight ends in the league. It's not even the drop on the 2-point conversion, actually, because it happens, right? And Lamar came out and said, it's everybody. We all can't make mistakes. I can't make mistakes. But when you saw the play where after he makes the big catch, the massive catch, you're in the middle of the field, multiple defenders around you, you are not going to shimmy shake and pick up another 15, 20 yards. He starts going east and west. They punch it out. The fumble really changed the complexion of that game as well. So, and it's a credit to the teams that avoided those issues, right? Play smart. Let your defense win some battles for you. And just know that if we play clean football, we're probably going to come out on the right side of it. Both those games to me were really were coin flip games going in, and if not for turnovers, could have looked very different.
The only other thing that I thought about while watching the games was yesterday during that Eagles-Rams game. The thought popped into my head. The only reason why the Philadelphia Eagles will not win the Super Bowl is Jalen Hurts.
Well, and that, yes, and I didn't remember that's kind of a part of it too, where I was like, if not for the turnovers, we'd be saying Jalen Hurts needs Saquon Barkley to be that every week in order for them to be able to win.
He threw for 128 yards. He averaged 6.4 yards per attempt. He was 7 sacks. They were all over him. It's probably going to come out after the season that he's hurt or he's been dealing with something, because the last month or two of Jalen Hurts has not looked good. It is extremely concerning. AJ Brown with the self-help book, AJ Brown was onto something. He knows that Jalen Hurts is limited as a passer, and that limits the ceiling that the Eagles have. They desperately needed a guy like Saquon Barkley because their quarterback is as limited as he is. Adam, do you feel the same way? The only way the Eagles don't win the Super Bowl is because Jalen Hurts can't throw the football right now.
Yeah, probably. And I hesitate to I don't want to overstate, I don't want to listen. Nobody on this podcast is a fan of the Eagles. Let's, keep it clear here. But I also don't want to overstate what Jalen Hurts is not. What I will say is with Jaden Daniels playing the way he's playing. I mean, listen, we're not even talking about that they throttled the Detroit Lions and that, hey, a lot of coordinators are going to leave here. Jared Goff, this is why, it's not just him. It's why you talk about the difference between the elite of the elites and all the other guys, right? And he didn't quite come across the line there. So I mean, it was awesome to watch that game just from a pure talent standpoint. It was awesome. Then you take a step back and you realize it's NFC East teams and we look like idiots. But the one thing I'll say is it's going to be interesting to see how game scripts flip as well. Going into that Rams-Eagles game, a lot of the talk was the weather and how it's going to impact and what Stafford's record is in cold weather and snow games, whatever. It also impacts every quarterback. So now you go and you play some clean. Maybe we'll see what the weather looks like in Philly next week when Washington comes to town. Then that can dictate it a little bit too. But Jalen Hurts is no longer, I think when we talk about him, we'd probably say, is he upper second tier? Is he right at the top of that second tier? Yeah, we can have that discussion, but he's not the elite of the elites. He's not one of those guys that you think, oh man, Andy's favorite term is a force multiplier. Can I give you one more? And then you can close out with whatever you want. But one more note that I had here, because on last week, I brought up some of the backup quarterbacks, keep an eye on over the course of the weekend, just teams to think about could be free agents. And a lot of people were like, Hendon Hooker. Got to go trade, you trade for Hendon Hooker. He's in his, he's already 26 years old, but experienced player, bring him in, a lot of pedigree coming out of college. Well, Teddy Bridgewater was the backup. Teddy Bridgewater is the one who came in when Goff got his bell rung. So just on a high level, relating it back to the Giants, I at least need him to be the backup quarterback before I get excited about bringing a player in. And that's not me advocating for Teddy Bridgewater, but it's just a reality of if your organization going to the playoffs didn't think that your backup all year had the ability to take over if Goff went down, that kind of tells you everything as far as bridge guys and bringing a quarterback into the room.
Yeah, that's a very good point on Hendon Hooker. He's not even getting snaps as the backup. But at the end of the day, Adam, the one thing that was clear to me is that my dream of having Matt Stafford as the Giants quarterback is back on. And
right back
we
up.
are
important. Good note.
We're back. Put the word out. We're back up. If anyone's watched The Wire before, we're back up over here. Right. Adam, they asked him about his future. He said he's going to have to think about some things. They asked Sean McVay in the front office. They said, I'm not worried about next year. I'm not thinking about next year. There is a ton of buzz that Matt Stafford will not be the quarterback anymore because the organization wants to go young. They have a very young team. They want to change the direction a bit. The LA Rams can save $22 million if they trade and get draft capital. Imagine if the Giants lost Mike Kafka and got 2 compensatory picks, and they just gave those compensatory picks for Matt Stafford, 2 third-round picks for Matt Stafford, and he's here for the next 2 years. Adam, I am feeling good. The only thing that makes me feel better about seeing the Commanders versus the Eagles and an NFC East for the NFC Championship is the fact that I might get my wish and I might get Matt Stafford as the New York Giants quarterback next year.
It's such small margins, man. Rams win that game. They go to the NFC Championship. All of a sudden you think, well, LA may retool this whole thing. Why not keep Stafford around? Why not? And by the way, man, did that defense look good though? God, verse for the I mean, we didn't do this. We have this in our notes for an episode, going through their draft picks and just how effing good they are, finding talent and rebuilding low cost, young, right? Like the thing the Giants just cannot do. It takes them 5 drafts to find 3 players. Oh my God, they're like watching that the week prior in the wild card round was so phenomenal. So there are things about that make a lot of sense. Now, whether or not LaFleur, as we talked about once upon a time, is the tandem, we can't dream on that anymore because we're keeping Brian Daboll. But an interesting conversation to have, one that we will have as the season progresses, as the offseason progresses, I should say, for the New York Football Giants. In the meantime, we got 4 games coming up next week, the title games, championship in each AFC and NFC. Listen, man, I say 4, I mean teams. I say 2, I mean games. Chiefs, obviously, will be taking on the Bills. That's a familiar scenario. And then the NFC East battle to go to the Super Bowl. Yeah, there's a rookie quarterback in Jayden Daniels that's trying to make a little bit of history. And for whatever it's worth, it is awesome because they're not that team yet. Wait until they beat us another few years in a row. But right now, it's kind of cool that the Washington Commanders, the Washington organization, is back on the NFL map. They're one of those teams, man. They deserve to be in that conversation, so I don't hate them yet. And that makes me really probably root for Washington next week. Until next time, though, guys, you guys on YouTube, see our faces. I got this like salmon hat that I've been wearing, which I think is pretty nice. And he's, he's popping his collar, he's doing his thing too. And then over on the podcast feed, wherever you get those needs fulfilled. Until next time. Until the best times, as Andrew Mackwitz would want, need, and nay, demand that people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.